Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, good morning, for all of you out there from all over the world. We've got listeners in this morning. I hope you're well in these extraordinary conditions. You're all very most welcome to the second session that we've got for you today in the Keeping the Dream Alive series by WeTac, My Travel Research, and Low Season Traveller. Before we get started, a few general housekeeping rules for you. You're all on mute to avoid background noise, but please do feel free to use the chat functionality just to let us know you're here. Apart from anything else, say hello. Do also feel free to send in any questions for Chris, our presenter today, that you have from today's session. You can see the questions function on the toolbar on the side. Send through the questions, we'll get through as many as we possibly can. One of the questions that we had come up again and again, and we've put it on the chat, Carolyn's put it up there, is will the session be recorded? Yes, it will be recorded. Yes, we'll release it out, and we'll send it out, links to that on email as well after the event. So as we said, welcome to the series. This is the second session in a series of 12 where we're going to hear from global experts in the fields of marketing and communications, tourism data, aviation, hospitality, and many more. So please do sign up to the whole series and feel free to share all the links and everything that you see with your friends and industry colleagues. Finally, we can't provide any of these sessions without the kind support of our partners in this series. So huge thanks to all of the partners, which you can see listed on the screen just below me if you've got me above. So let me introduce myself properly. My name is Jed Brown, and I'm the founder and CEO of Low Season Traveller, and also the managing director in EMEA of the World Tourism Association for Culture and Heritage. And I've got the honour of being your moderator for this entire series. And what a series we've got. This is the second episode, which is entitled Lessons from the Past in Crisis and Resilient. And I should point out to you all that we had originally considered that this would be the first session before we secured the fantastic David Bierman for last Tuesday's session. But this webinar series can be considered very much in the same way as a novel. There are many chapters, but hopefully each one follows on from the past. And David provided us with an overview of what a crisis is and what recovery tactics typically there are that we can employ. Today, we're moving on to lessons from the past. And when traveling to an unknown destination like the post-COVID 2019 world, we need to, first of all, understand how we got to be in the current situation and how we faced up to similar challenges in the past. And so I'm delighted to introduce you to our keynote speaker for today, which is, of course, Chris Flynn, who is the President and CEO of the World Tourism Association for Culture and Heritage. A little bit of a biog of Chris, with more than 30 years experience in international tourism, working in countries across 4 continents. Chris has developed an intimate knowledge of the industry and is recognized for his ability to identify future trends which have the potential to influence and impact the industry. A leading specialist in terms of development and strategy, Chris is a regular speaker at high-profile international events and provides insights to leading news media channels such as BBC World Service, Asia Business Reports, which boasts a live global audience in excess of 400 million. I'm not sure there'll be the same size of audience today, Chris, but anyway. Formerly the Regional Director Pacific for the Pacific Asia Travel Association, PARTA, a position that required liaison at the most senior levels of industry and government within the 20 nations of his portfolio. Chris's expertise is often sought by leading Australian and international businesses and university faculties. In this session, Chris is going to be taking us through some of the past crises, and we should advise that some of the images in the presentation you're about to see are powerful and could be considered to be culturally sensitive. So with that, Chris, you're very welcome to join us for the session.
Hello, Jed. How are you doing?
Hello. I'm very good indeed, Chris. How are you this morning? This evening, I should say.
This evening, I'm fine. I'm kind of holding my breath here that we don't have another crisis. It looks like we're going to have a big storm outside, and I've got a tin roof. So if you've got a big storm, you're not going to be able to hear anything I say. So as long as that doesn't happen, we should be good to go. I take it it's tropical in Manchester, is it?
Of course it is, Chris. It's Yeah, actually, it is sun shining, but it's very cold. We should, Chris. I think we should let people in on what just happened 1 minute before we switched on the broadcast, because it does sum up exactly, about crises and recovery. But just for all of our listeners which are out there, this is just a great example. Before I was doing the introductory speech, with 1 minute to go, everything disappeared off my screen. And the panic, as I'm sure Chris will attest, that was in my voice must have been palpable, was it, Chris?
I thought it was hilarious.
But it just goes to show what happens. And we got to the point where I just said, you know what, we'll just wing it. But that's what you have to deal with, and you have to deal with it on the fly and try and recover things. But anyway, Chris, I'll hand over to you. Let's get going.
Okay, excellent. Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everybody. It's absolutely fantastic for me to be here and to present today, which is episode 2 of the series. And this is Lessons from the Past, Crisis, Resilience, and Context. And I've put context into the title simply because one of the reasons we want to do this is for us to look back and to appreciate where we've been before, and to balance where we need to go in the future in terms of how we're going to transition out of this. Two things to bear in mind is that when we look at crisis, there are two categories that we generally relate to. The first one is a crisis beyond the control of management. And there are certain aspects of this, such as natural disasters, acts of war or terrorism, political upheaval, crime waves, epidemics, and sudden global, regional, or domestic shocks. The second is a business collapse due to management failure. Now, this could be financial fraud, it could be data loss, destructions of a workplace, particularly with fire and flood, and if you don't have the necessary insurance. There's also potential reputation issues if a campaign goes wrong, or if something happens from a consumer perspective. Another one is loss of management or key staff, etc. So these are the kinds of things that we need to consider when we talk about crisis in the various different categories. Now, one thing we do know about crisis, it's often immediate and it's often dramatic. And whenever I think about tourism in crisis, believe it or not, I think of this guy. This is a guy called Yogi Berra. He was one of New York Yankees' top players way back. He wasn't only famous for playing ball, he was very famous for his quotes. And one of his most famous quotes is this: "It's like deja vu all over again." And often with tourism crisis, it is a bit like deja vu. We see things happen. We see things repeat themselves. Today is a little bit different, and we're going to be exploring that a bit later. But bear this in mind, that very often we've been there before. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to look back again to give us perspective. And I'm going to go from 2001 to 2011. And you might think to yourself, okay, well, why is he going from 2001? Well, the main reason is because of this. This is something I'm sure we all remember, or we're all familiar with. This was New York in 2001, September 11, 9/11, as it's better known. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center that were hit by the aircraft and ultimately collapsed, killing almost 3,000 people. Our industry changed that day. It changed forever. And the reason for that was that people who were used to traveling suddenly felt vulnerable. There was a sense of panic, uncertainty. Things had to be put in place, like increased security measures at airports and on aircraft themselves, things that have only grown ever since this. So this sense of fear, of panic, of anxiety that happened through 2001, September 11, this is something that we've lived with now ever since. Not long after, only a matter of weeks, we saw the start of the Afghan war. This turned out to be the longest war in US history. And again, this sense of uncertainty, this sense of anxiety was compounded by these unusual events that were now taking place in our history. The following year, 2002, the 12th of October, we had the Bali bomb. And this was a surprise for most people. Bali was this place of mystique, this beautiful, innocent part of the world. And literally in one night, its innocence was taken. We lost 202 people that night, and most of them actually came from here, from Australia. So there was this great sense of loss, both from the people here and also probably the people of Bali themselves. There are casualties and victims in any of these things. And of course, Bali is a tourist destination, and with this happening, everything stopped immediately. One of the things we learned from this was to do with the trial of the terrorists who planted the bomb. Now, you might think that's a bit strange, but what actually happened was the trial was televised. So this was shown on televisions all over the world. So all it did is it compounded the terrorist threat itself. So why would you want to go back to a destination where this was still happening? It just reinforced that message literally every day in the houses of some of those that were affected. And of course, the destination itself wasn't able to recover to the same degree because of it. On the 19th of March 2003, we saw the start of the Iraq War. Now, this was something that had been talked about and planned for quite some time. So there was no surprise. We already saw the level of anxiety starting to happen. What we couldn't have imagined is just 2 weeks later, we had SARS. Now, I'm not going to focus on SARS right now. We're going to talk about this a little bit later on. But this was something that had, just like 9/11, an immediate effect on our industry. 2004, we saw the Boxing Day Tsunami, 9.1 magnitude earthquake, where the tectonic plates slipped one below the other, creating a giant wave that traveled across the ocean at over 400 kilometers an hour. You can see from this map just where it hit. The epicenter, of course, was Indonesia. We had Thailand and Sri Lanka, but the wave got all the way to South America and various other parts of the world. The damage it did and the destruction it created was unbelievable. You can see here from Banda Aceh, this is in Indonesia. That's the before and after shot of that area once the wave had gone through. We lost 275,000 people that day, which is almost unbelievable to even comprehend. You can't even imagine that kind of a number. And of course, because it was a wave, it was hitting resorts, it was hitting holiday destinations all over the Indian Ocean and creating massive destruction. So there was volunteerism and there was a massive international effort to try and rebuild these areas, to try and recover. But another compounding factor of this was beliefs and religions that played a part. Some of the areas couldn't go back to work because there were so many people who had died. There were so many people who were missing. And the people who were missing, for example, the fishermen wouldn't go out to fish because they believed that the fish were feeding off the bodies that were still missing. That could have been true, but it was against their beliefs to actually go out and fish. So something needed to be done. And the solution that happened or that came together was the plan to have a series of ceremonies in Thailand, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, etc. And this one here, this is from Thailand. And the idea was to light these lanterns and to set them free, symbolically being the setting free of a spirit, of a soul, it rising to heaven. And once we got through, or once these ceremonies had actually taken place, these destinations were able to begin again. Until this happened, everything was on hold. So these are the kind of things that happen in crisis that might be, particular to a particular country or area that we need to consider. 2005, of course, the London bombing, specifically aimed at the capital to bring the country to a halt, and also to shock visitors to that particular area, because as we know, tourism destinations are favored by these people. In 2005, just a month later, the most destructive hurricane in US history. This was Hurricane Katrina. Now, I want you to look at that image. That is a satellite image of the hurricane itself. Just keep that in the back of your mind for a bit later. As I say, this was the most destructive in US history. 1,833 people killed, over $125 billion in damages. And, you know, it's a funny thing that when we talk about millions and billions, we often get confused. It doesn't really translate. They both sound the same. So I'm going to give you a little bit of mental arithmetic to consider to give us a perspective when we're talking about millions and billions. If you were to take 1 million seconds away from today, you would end up with 12 days, around 12 days. If you take 1 billion seconds away from today, you end up with 33 years. So when we start talking about billions and $125 billion worth of damage, you can see just how immense that is. And of course, a lot of the recovery process is still actually going on in this part of the world. A crisis that happened that I think many have forgotten was the massive earthquake in Chengdu in 2008. This was a 7.9 magnitude earthquake that caused massive damage. It destroyed almost every road and highway in the region. It closed the airport for a while. And when you look at it, there was 87,000 people killed in the Chengdu earthquake, 374,000 injured, and 18,000 still missing. Now, of course, we might think that that's a destination that's far away. It doesn't really interest us because we don't deal with China, but people do. In all of these crises that we're talking about now, there are tour companies and operators that are dealing in these areas. And this is why I'm showing all of this, because it happens not just on a big scale, but it can also happen on a small scale. 2008 again, we saw the Taj Hotel in Mumbai, another tourist track. 2009, the terror attacks in Jakarta, the JW Marriott, Ritz-Carlton hotels. Again, tourist iconic areas. This one is close to my heart, and I wanted to feature this for my own personal reasons. This was the 2009 tsunami in Samoa. That's Western Samoa and American Samoa. I actually took this photograph. I was there 2 or 3 days after the event, and this was one of the resorts that was completely wiped out. Now, there was 180 people killed, and you might think, oh, well, that's not too many. When you live on an island destination, when you're part of a culture, almost a tribal culture in these areas, 180 people is huge. Not only that, the vast majority were children, either on their way to school or on their way home from school, having been sent back home once the tsunami alarms had sounded, and they had no idea what was coming. Absolute tragic. Once I'd left Western Samoa, I went to American Samoa, to Pango, and the wave that came in, it wasn't just one wave, there was 4 waves that came in, and it caused massive damage. One of the things it did, which absolutely amazed me, was it stripped the graveyards. The wave came in and it emptied the graves, and there were coffins and remains all over the roads. Imagine that. When I was there, the coffins and the caskets were stacked up against walls, and what people had done is they put the remains that they could find in any of the caskets that they could find. So for years now, they've been doing DNA testing to find out who the remains belong to, what graves they should be in. And this is, as far as I'm aware, something that's still going on, but it was very confronting to actually see all of that. The other thing that we did, or in Western Samoa, is I took a team of specialists up there on my second visit to see how we could support the destination, to see how we could help it recover. Now, with any crisis, there is usually some businesses that are unaffected, and those businesses want to go back to trade as soon as possible. And there was no exception in the situation in Samoa. But all it took was one walk around the beaches on the south coast, where the wave hit to realize there's no way in the world this could happen. You're probably wondering what that image is that you're looking at right now. Here's another view of it. It's a piece of corrugated iron from a roof that was sticking out of the sand. That piece of iron was almost 2 meters long, and they were scattered all over the beach and in the ocean. Now, if they'd have opened for business, if they'd have gone out to the industry and said, yep, we're still open, we've still got hotels that can take you, and a child or a family member or anyone for that matter was to dive into the ocean and dive on top of that, your reputation would be finished for good. So what we did is, with the team that I took up there, we looked at how to communicate with the industry globally, regionally, how to communicate with the operators, both within Samoa and overseas. We wrote a recovery strategy plan, which included rebranding and again, a whole strategy for how to re-emerge from this terrible crisis, because of course Samoa, their main economy is lofted on tourism. In 2009, the global financial crisis, and I'm sure we can all remember that. It was devastating for so many people around the world. And of course, from a tourism perspective, we just literally fell off a cliff. You can see here that it bottomed out in 2009, but it began in 2007. And when we actually look at how we've tracked since, you will see that we haven't actually achieved or got to the points to where we were before then. And right now, 2020, we've fallen off that cliff again. But there's an unknown there. We don't know how we are going to transition from an economic perspective out of this crisis at this point. Now, Cyclone Yasi, 2nd of February, close to my heart again, because that's my birthday. You can all send me a card if you wish. This was an enormous cyclone. This was 3 separate cells that joined together to create this massive beast of destruction. It flooded an area of Queensland that was the size of France and Germany combined. Just think about that. All of that flooded. The whole of Brisbane, including the CBD, was completely underwater. And of course, in Australia, when that happens, you have additional risks. This was one of them. This was taken just outside of Brisbane, where because the river systems have flooded, the crocodiles were now on the pavements and in the suburbs and in local parks. So again, crisis can go a little bit deeper sometimes. Now, remember when I said to you, remember the size of Hurricane Katrina? This is why I said that. This was the size of Cyclone Yasi. It was actually the size of the USA. And that slammed into Australia on the 2nd of February, causing massive damage, as you can appreciate. The loss of life wasn't as great as it could have been, simply because it hit a place that didn't have huge population areas. Finally, in this part of the presentation, I just want to talk about the Japanese tsunami. Those who remember this, I was at ITB in Berlin when I turned on the TV and I saw this, and I saw these images, and I thought, oh my God, well, you know, this is unbelievable. And when you look at what actually happened here, almost 16,000 deaths, over 6,000 people injured, 2,500 people still missing, and we almost had a nuclear catastrophe as well with the flooding of the reactors. I thought I'd show you this image because this image looks like a before and after shot. It's not. This is actually the wave moving into an area that hadn't been touched by the water yet. Imagine seeing that coming. Unbelievable. So when we look at global international visitor arrivals, or IVAs as we call them, and we look at it over that period, in spite of everything that I've shown you, we had one small drop in 2001 because of September 11. We had a drop again in 2003 because of SARS. And don't forget, September 11 happened at the end of that year, almost September. This happened, it only lasted for 2 months. And of course, the global financial crisis. So now we're faced with this, COVID-19. And of course, we are in uncharted waters here. We don't really know what's going to happen. So the closest thing to look at would be SARS, because SARS was something that we had to live through, that we feared was going to be the next pandemic. So let's have a look at what actually happened here. SARS happened predominantly in March and April of 2003, 2 months. SARS was effectively cleared in May of that year. There was massive media attention. SARS was expected to become the new pandemic. And of course, the media kind of been waiting for this for so long. When we actually look at the map, you'll see here that the number of cases was around about 6,000. And deaths, there was less than 800. And there was not that many countries in real terms affected. Canada, China, some Southeast Asian countries. Well, quite interestingly, other countries that weren't affected, that didn't have any SARS cases, such as Australia, was also affected. And that is because, in tourism terms, people wouldn't transit via areas that had the SARS virus, so Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. In reality, there were very few deaths, but the media frenzy continued. And you can see here, this is just some of the news outlets and publications that you can see. And it's quite interesting to see that a lot of what we're seeing on screen here is almost mirrored today with how the virus began, where it transcended to, etc. What we saw is that panic gripped society. We weren't prepared for this. The world stopped traveling. Literally everybody stopped. Fear and anxiety was everywhere. And when we look at some of the numbers, this is inbound visitor arrivals because of SARS in some of the affected areas of Southeast Asia. And you can see here in April and May, when it was at its most prevalent, that we had some significant drops. If you look at Chinese Taipei, Taiwan, in May it was minus 83%, Singapore minus 70%. But SARS was considered clear by mid-May, but it still continued to fall. Chinese Taipei minus 76 in June, 38% in Hong Kong, etc., 50% in Vietnam. It continued. And in fact, in Taiwan, they never recovered for the entire year. And it only lasted for 2 months. So you need to balance that and think about that when we start to think about how we are going to navigate our way out of COVID-19. The other thing that we saw is that air traffic went into a steep decline. And that was a combination of both SARS and the Iraq War. When we look at US load factors, now this is a little bit of a complicated graph, so I'll take you through it. This is US aviation load factors between 2000 and 2003. Now here, you'll see in January, the average load factor is around about, say, 72%. As we move into the peak season, the harder months, summer season, July, August, it goes up to about 78, 79%. Now, if you look at the orange line, which represents 2001, look how steep that fall was. And that was due to September 11. The good news was it did start to transition out of that by the end of the year. When we look at SARS, the green line, you can see again just how steep that fall was in terms of aviation numbers and load factors. But you'll see again that the fall actually began in January. And that was because of the speculation of the Iraq War and the anxiety and fear that was growing within the communities, not just of the US, but globally. We saw that airline stocks fell dramatically because of this. United Airlines, US Airways, Air Canada, all filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. And I have to keep emphasizing, this only lasted for 2 months. IATA predicted the global airline industry would lose $10 billion that year. In actual fact, US carriers alone lost more than that. And when we look at Asia Pacific Airlines, it's a similar story. It's not just US carriers. Here's the drop, but it actually began in January of that year with the anxiety of the Iraq War. And it took us to get some form of stability a whole year to recover, to June 2004. The other thing that we saw is that conferences and corporate events were cancelled globally. Many hotels in affected areas were running at less than 10%. In fact, this is a graph of what happened in Hong Kong in 2003. And I'll never forget, there was one night, it's quite famous now, there was one night where the Peninsula Hotel in Kowloon, this magnificent property, only had one guest. Never in its history have they had that, or could they ever have imagined that. The other thing that happened is there were significant industry job losses, and of course we're seeing that right now. During this period between 2001 2003, 6.5 million jobs were lost. 3 million lost in China, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Vietnam. Direct and indirect, approximately 8 million jobs were lost, predominantly during the SARS epidemic. And $20 billion was gone from GDP. The positive of all of this is that post 2011, we saw a steep increase. This is an incredibly resilient industry, and we bounce back. Now, it might take a bit longer with what we're going through right now, and how it will emerge might be different, but it will come back, absolutely. But we're here, and we have to live with it. Now, we have to deal with it. And it's funny because when I looked at Yogi Berra and his quotes, I have to think about him again when I get to this point, because another thing that he said was this. He said, the way a team plays as a whole determines its success. You might have the greatest bunch of individual stars in the world, but if they don't play together, the club won't be worth a dime. And that is the whole idea about running this series, because we're all in this together. And if we don't work out the solutions together, if we don't share our experiences, our expertise, our ideas, our innovations, it'll take much longer. So I thank all of you for supporting this series. And that's my presentation over and out for now. So I think we're into a Q&A, if I'm not mistaken, Jed.
We are indeed. Chris, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for that. Really interesting to see, of all of those, crises that you were showing there and that we've been talking about, one thing which really comes through on all of those slides is the incredible resilience of the travel industry. And, what you were showing there in terms of not only the drops, but how quickly, in many cases, the tourism arrivals were bouncing back. Is COVID-19 the ultimate test of this, for want of a better word, bounce back ability of the sector? Is this? Well, it's certainly the sternest test we've ever faced, right?
Absolutely. You can't really imagine things on a scale to what we're seeing right now. And I know that there are people out there that will be thinking that maybe we could get back to normal quickly, but that's not going to happen. And there are people that might think that there's going to be a lot of pent-up demand, and there is, but it's going to be more pent-up aspiration and desire, because the amount of people who could afford to travel again post this is going to be significantly less, because it's not only the crisis of COVID-19, it's the financial crisis as well, and so many people being out of work. So what we're going to see is a transition as people begin to travel. Once they begin to step out of the front door again, if you will, they tend to travel domestically first. They find their feet, and it builds confidence. The next step will be to travel a bit further, maybe regionally. So if I was in Manchester like you, Jed, I might jump on a plane and head out to Europe a little bit. What we found with SARS and the recovery time with SARS was that people were reluctant to travel any great distance initially for fear that they might get trapped again And we've seen during the COVID-19 scenario already how many people have been stranded around the world, how many people have needed to be, rescued, if you will, and brought back to their home countries around the world. So this kind of underlying fear, this kind of underlying anxiety will be around for a while. So to answer your question, this is going to be the ultimate test, but I also believe if we get it right, it's the ultimate opportunity.
Very good. There's some questions starting to come through, Chris, online now, so I'm going to start to take you through some of those. We've got a question here from Sanjay Kinney. With the new social distancing norms, will leisure tourists be willing to travel to densely populated countries like India and China? What do you think?
Sanjay, thank you for your question. Eventually, yes. Initially, no. Again, it comes down to this fear of the unknown. Also, there's certain things at the moment, transparency issues. Rightly or wrongly, if one government is less transparent than another, we don't really know what the numbers are. And when we're talking about, huge populations of, 1.3 billion in India and these crowded cities, I don't think people are going to be comfortable going back to those kind of areas immediately. It's going to take some time. Having said that, this is where the opportunity is there for a destination to rethink how they promote, how they sell, how they position, what kind of tourists they want. Do they want mass tourism, or do they want a more, sort of quality focused tourist? These are the kind of question and answers that we're going to be asking over the coming months. But really, Sanjay, I very much doubt that people are going to be wanting to rush back into crowded environments anytime soon if the threat of COVID-19 is still literally in the air.
Do you think as a society, we're, again, the world over, we're all in a similar position, we're all in these lockdowns. Do you think there are signs that we are starting to change how we view I suppose crowded situations? I find already when I'm looking at TV programs that are obviously recorded pre-COVID-19, and you see big crowds of people together and people are hugging and embracing and whatever else just on a TV program, I almost kind of wince because already I am, in a very short space of time, I'm kind of quite conditioned to keeping away from other people. So here in Manchester, we're allowed to go for a walk every day. I go for my walk, and I'm crossing over the street if there's somebody on the same side of the path as me, which is quite strange because usually I'd always say good morning or whatever as you pass, and now I'm actually, going out of my way to avoid being anywhere near them. Are we actually going to start getting a little bit more conditioned into that, and is that going to be in our framework, either subconsciously or consciously?
I think with any crisis that happens, it's not just a change of circumstance or condition, it's a change of mindset. It's a behavioral change. And like you, Jed, I'm seeing this here in Sydney itself. I go to my supermarket, and usually when you go up an escalator, there's 100 people running up there and squeezing past them, and I'm usually one of them, But now everybody stays on the escalator with their 1.5 meter space. Nobody rushes. Everybody takes their time, and people tend to be more respectful of each other, respectful of each other's circumstance and space. And I think this kind of behavioral change and change of mentality, if you will start to play out in the tourism offerings that we offer in the future. I don't think people are going to want to go back to crazy, crowded situations that we've seen, particularly in some of the areas of Europe, or the over-tourism issues that we've seen elsewhere. People are now starting to see, a blanket lift in terms of pollution and overcrowding and what have you. And that's really what they want. In my own opinion is that tourism has grown sort of exponentially over the years without the checks and balances we really need. A lot of the tours and holidays that are sold really are not delivering what's on the tin, if you will. They're not delivering what's advertised. The people are going into situations and into resorts that are crowded with people. Nobody really wants that. So maybe this is a chance for us to reset things, to press the reset button and to work with destinations, to work with tour operators, to work with industry, to try to change and mold the industry for what it should be.
It kind of links on to another question that we've had through from Mohammed Shukavant. Hi, Mohammed, and thank you for the question. How could operators adapt themselves with customers' psychological changes? How should tourism activists come into connectivity? I suppose that's linked to what we were just talking about there, really.
It is. It's kind of, thank you, Mohammed, for the question. It kind of links to what we were saying there with the behavioral change and with the change of psychology. I suppose to some degree, less is more. I would say that tour numbers or group numbers would probably be less. The price would probably be more, but the quality and the value would be vastly different in terms of those two aspects, the quality and the value. So what we will probably lose on volume as such in terms of yield revenue, we can gain on quality and yield.
Yep. The questions are flooding in, Chris. You'll be glad to know. Let me get to another way. Right, good question, Stu Spears. Can you elaborate a little on what you see as the opportunities that are coming out of this? Great question, Stu.
Yeah, thanks, Stu. Again, this is the opportunities that I see, Stu, are really in terms of responsible tourism, sustainable tourism. Now, this isn't a quick fix. This is not instant coffee. It's not going to happen overnight. But again, I think there's organizations out there, including WeTech. We focus on culture and heritage, and it's all to do with protecting what we've got. A lot of what we have, including culture, environment, once it's gone, it's gone. We have a chance to take a breath. We have a chance to take a step back and to work with destinations and particularly governments on how to move forward on this. One of the big issues is that the majority of ministers around the world, particularly those who focus on tourism, don't like to have any kind of negative growth on their watch. They don't really look at the value. They don't really look at the yield. They just don't want to have to say, oh, well, we got less, our visitor arrivals last year were -5%. We have to change that conditioning. We have to change that mentality. We have to explain to these key decision makers that it's about quality. It's about the protection of environment, species, culture, heritage, those assets that are irreplaceable. And if we can start to put those in place, that, Stu, in my opinion, will be where we make the greatest leap forward in terms of tourism in the future.
Great question again. Another question for Chris. This is from Stephen Eccleston. For Chris, this is the $1 million question. What kind of time frame do you estimate for international travel recovery? I suppose, I'll add, if I may, Stephen, if you'll forgive me, I'll add to that is, there's a time frame for recovery, but also, are we actually ever going to see a full recovery, do you think?
That is a good question, and of course it's an unknown, and it's right. It's why I wanted to show what happened in SARS or during SARS, because SARS, effectively lasted for 2 months. The recovery time in terms of aviation and room nights, etc., took a year. This is going to take years, and it won't go back to how it was, and maybe it shouldn't go back to how it was. It's going to take time. It's going to take careful planning. And another thing that we learned during SARS, which I think is quite important, is when it comes to consumers and travelers, and when it comes to their decision making, or in terms of should we travel, what we found was that when destinations themselves, affected destinations, announced that they were SARS free and, hey, we're open for your business and please come back, everybody, nobody really believed them. And that's why we saw the continued fall in July and August, etc. Because of course there's self-interest in that message. Of course you want people to come back. It drives your economy. We found that what was more effective was having third-party endorsement. It might be UNWTO. It might be the World Trade Organization. It might be WETAC. It could be all of these organizations that work with destinations but don't have any skin in the game as such. They don't have anything to gain from this. So part of how you communicate your message, how you position yourself post-COVID-19, requires the assistance and support of third-party endorsement. To come back to your question, Stephen, how long is it going to take? It's going to take years.
It's there's been so many. It's such a popular question, and I've heard it myself bandied around, and it's the $1 million question that everybody wants to know. And my feeling is that I nearly hope it's the case that it's not going to recover to 2019 levels for years. But the hope is that we can, I suppose, at least recover in the right way and come out of it a little bit better. Sorry, go on. Sorry, Chris.
I was going to say, because everybody, it doesn't matter who it is in this industry, everybody has to do a rethink now. There is no get out of jail free card on this one. Every single destination, tour operator, travel company has to rethink this. So I think you're going to start to see a pattern emerge in the way that we start to recover, and hopefully we won't go back, as you say, to some of those crazy days in these incredibly overcrowded areas.
It links actually to just again squeezing through. There's been a couple of comments similar to this. This one's Jason Hill. Is over-tourism going to be a problem again in the future, or do you think destinations will actually use this as an opportunity to manage things differently to negate this? When demand disappears, it is hard to focus on sustainability.
That's true. Well, that's a fantastic observation, Jason. It is hard to focus on sustainability, and that's why I said that kind of process is not instant coffee. That's got to run parallel to everything that we do. Of course, we've got to get back on that ladder and start to climb. It's how we start to climb that ladder and what our key considerations are as we start to climb that ladder. If we climb that ladder with blinkers and we just want to go back to the way we were, I think those are the destinations that will suffer the most, because of that behavioral change that we're seeing, that change in consumer psychology that we're seeing. This is what's going to drive demand in the future. And demand isn't all about numbers. Demand covers a whole range of different things. So yeah, sustainability will run parallel, get up the ladder, but do it in a more responsible way. That's the way I see it.
Yep.
Did that answer the question, by the way? Not quite sure.
I think so. I'm sorry. I'm trying to. It's so hard. Okay. I'm trying to focus on reading the questions as I'm listening to you, and it's really hard. So many questions. No, so many questions, which is great, and that's that's the most important thing, and that's why I just want to make sure that everybody gets to have their questions addressed at least. Question is. This is from Kevin Murphy. Is that reset you're suggesting likely to reduce numbers and considerably from the IVAs of 2018-19, and by how much? 20%, 30%, or not at all? Those are your three options, Chris, because not too much will change by those who will have survived in the business. Is the reset likely to reduce numbers and considerably from the IVAs of 2018-19?
Absolutely, of course it will. Yeah. And one of the main reasons why the numbers are going to be reduced is because a lot of the systems that are in place or were in place pre-COVID-19 are not going to be there. Yeah. I mean, I read yesterday, Lufthansa, the national carrier of Germany, is looking for a bailout over the next 48 hours. Otherwise, it's going to go into administration. The low-cost airlines that we see around the world, how many of them are going to be around, if any? So from
Yeah.
a sheer capacity issue in terms of transportation, that's going to be driving, demand and growth and what have you. And the volume that was there pre-COVID-19 just isn't going to be there. So those percentage numbers, 20, 30% or zero, can't really comment on that because we don't know who's going to exist in the future. I think it was Bill Gates who probably about 10 years ago now, he said that he saw in the future that there'd be mass consolidation within the international airline structure. And
Yep.
he estimated that, I think it was around about 2025 or something like that, that there would only be between 10 and 12 major international airlines in operation. Now, I don't think he was factoring in a pandemic, but that could be a scenario that we see, this
Yeah.
mass consolidation of
It's
airlines around the world.
it's interesting actually. We've spoken to so we've got John Grant of Midas Aviation, and he also does work, of course, with OAG. And obviously we've got him on the series later on to specifically talk about aviation. But I've spoken to John Grant about this, and I think the feeling is out there that there's 300 major commercial airlines in the world today. And I think the feeling is that there was never really enough to justify that. The financial models and the economics of running an airline, they're really not very profitable. It's not a very profitable side of the industry to be in. And I think the feeling was that there was always too many airlines in the world, and it contributed to this over tourism that we saw, and these, you said it before yourself, Chris. If I can fly from Manchester to Dublin for the price of a Starbucks coffee, there's something wrong. There's something massively messed up in the system, and it's the fact that we've been keeping these airlines afloat almost artificially for so many years that it was almost going to take some big change in the world for the house of cards literally to come falling down. And I think COVID-19, that is the gust of wind that's blowing it all down. And I think you might have seen it as well, but for our listeners out there, if you haven't seen it, it's worth looking up on LinkedIn. There was a report by Credit Suisse which said that the liquidity of most of the major airlines was for about 3 months. And if they held on to all of the money which they're currently got for future travel, if they or travel that hasn't been provided, if they could hold on to that, it would give them liquidity for maybe 5 months, maybe 6 months. If they had to pay it out, then obviously they're in a very precarious position.
Peter Harbison from CAPA, Center of Aviation Pacific, whatever it is, did a report probably about a month ago, and CAPA estimated that by the end of May, 90% of global airlines will have disappeared or will have been in administration. But coming back to your point then about, if you can travel to Manchester, Dublin for a price of a cup of coffee, there is something wrong with that. But not only that, it lessens the quality of the tourism itself. If you have that kind of mass tourism, spending that kind of money, the quality of the visitor itself gets called into question. That in turn impacts the reputation of the destination. So do we really want to go back to that kind of scenario, or are we willing to, maybe buy 2 cups of coffee and fly to Dublin?
Do you think this is linked to a question from where? Gosh, it's so small on my screen, everybody. I'm really struggling, and I wear glasses as well. Dun, 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 dun. I forget who said it. Sorry, I can't find it. Is there an opportunity here for small regional destinations in Australia and everywhere else in the world that frequently in the past maybe they get overlooked for the big shiny destinations? Have they got an opportunity now, like they've never had before, to welcome guests in a sustainable manner, and really, I suppose in a way, if capitalize is the right word, capitalize on this situation?
I think so, and that's exactly how they should be thinking. A lot of regions and smaller towns, play fiddle to the larger destinations, and they try to, for want of a better phrase, pick up the scraps of what they can get. With the processes that are in place in terms of how people will begin to travel or return to travel post this crisis. As I said earlier, there will be growth in domestic. As people start to travel again, they will naturally go domestically. So you can pick up some growth there. But I think the big opportunity is when people start to expand a little bit further. So when they start to look at regional travel, whether that's regional within a country or whether it's regional sort of into a particular region, whether that's Asia or Europe or whatever, this is that's the time to really start to capitalize on getting access to those people. Because as I said, people are going to want more unique experiences. They're going to want less crowds. They're going to want to feel safer in these kind of destinations. So from a regional perspective, I think this presents itself as an ideal opportunity to rewrite the book, if you will.
Mm. It's, I mean, really, I guess this is a really great opportunity for niche travel, like never before, which actually gives, I suppose, smaller organizations an opportunity like they could have never dreamt of, because now you don't have to be a big guy to and in fact, actually, the big guys, they're probably ones which are getting harmed the most in all of this. And when I say the big guys, I mean the large tour operators, the large airlines. They're the ones that are being hurt the most by this. Is that right, or are the smaller guys getting hurt just as much? Who's not that it's a competition, but who is hurting the most from this? Who is suffering the most from this? And the only reason I ask that question is to try and ascertain, where there is the biggest opportunity as we come out of it.
Well, one of the things, I mean, simple answer is everybody's hurting from this, but the way the industry has developed and the way the industry was operating for so many years, the big boys had the purchasing capacity, as whether that's a distribution chain, travel agencies, wholesalers, or whatever, and they basically held all the cards. They could demand what they want, and if you couldn't provide them with what they want, they would just go elsewhere. I think what we're going to find now, it's not going to be level completely. Don't get me wrong, but we're going through a leveling process now. You could use the term a level playing field, but this is a leveling process. This is a time when everyone will take a step back and reanalyze how they do business, how they did business, and how they want to do business moving forward. I think some of the things that you're going to see, we haven't even thought about yet. You remember, the disruption caused by Airbnb and other disruptive companies that sort of suddenly appeared on our tourism radar. You're going to see so much more of that coming through. So the innovation side of the transition from COVID-19 is going to be very interesting to watch, because as we have to start doing things different, this is where the new models will start to take place and the new experiences will start to emerge. So it's going to be very interesting to watch. Again, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't say with any authority what's going to happen in the future. Nobody knows that. But these are the kind of things that we'll start to see.
I suppose that whole, the lack of a crystal ball, that is what we are all struggling with in this industry, in every industry actually, is the fact that when you're in unprecedented times, you can have as much experience in the world as you like, but if it's a situation that's never been faced before, it's very hard to understand how it's going to play out when nobody's ever been through it. And I suppose it links with, again, we've got a session coming up later on in the series, which is more about the data side of it. And that, I suppose, is where, data is incredibly valuable right now, because that, we discussed it before off air, Chris, facts, not fear. It's about what's real, and the data that you see is real. And there are some amazing data sets out there.
Yeah, it's, it is the word unprecedented, keeps getting raised, and it is, and we don't know how we're going to transition out of this. But the other thing about, again, the series that we're running, this 12-part series, is that as we run the series with the information that we find out, we mold that into the sessions that we're going to deliver. So we're trying to keep sort of like our knowledge base current as best we can and work that into the discussion process. It is going to be incredibly difficult. Jed, and as we've said before, we just don't know who's going to be there at the end of this. And so if you don't know that, how can you plan?
Yeah, that's part of the challenge. A great question here from, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Hiroko Suboi Friedman. What would be an inspiration for people to travel right now? So as we're coming out of this, thinking about how people are going to travel and how we're going to inspire them as an industry to travel, what would bring people to get interested to travel? Safety, curiosity, fulfilling experiences. What do you think is going to inspire people to actually travel, albeit nervously, as we first crawl out of this situation?
Well, first of all, honesty has to be out there. Truthfulness in terms of destinations, from a safety aspect and from an experience aspect. I think we're the word authenticity is thrown around a lot, but I think people, when they start to travel, I think it was Kevin Murphy earlier on who said that those who have the propensity to travel and the wealth to travel are not going to be affected as much as others. So what do they want? They want a quality experience, an authentic experience. I think that this whole idea of protection, this Mother Earth kind of thing, sits within the heart of all of us, really. And I'm not trying to preach, I'm not trying to say anything like this, but I think that coming from a crisis, the value of things will change. I remember, well, not remember, but the Second World War. My parents, when they came out of the Second World War and they had 5 years of rationing and everything else, their behavior changed, and it's still like that today. My mother would hate me for saying this, but she hasn't thrown anything out for the last 50 years into a wardrobe that's jam-packed. It's all to do with this change of mindset. So as we go through this change of mindset, that people will naturally start to become more conscious of the environment, more conscious of safety, more conscious of the need to protect, more conscious of the need to keep things safe. So, Hiroko, it's a very, very good question. I think honesty, authenticity, truthfulness, and having something that's genuine will be, hopefully, the way destinations will start to emerge from this. Let's call it responsible and quality tourism.
Yeah. Carolyn, our producer behind the scenes, are there any pertinent questions, Carolyn, that I'm missing out on?
Jed, there are so many, I'm not even sure where to begin. I mean, the quality of the questions again has just been so fabulous. So let me just run through and see. I'm having a laugh at Kevin's suggestion about the experiences will come back. He's suggesting missionary work. We've got some questions, some references which I think pick up on some of the stuff earlier in terms of social distance and the infrastructure changes that we might need to take into account. Whether either of you want to comment on that.
I'd like to add something to that if I may, because when we talk about the world traveling again, and people are sort of saying, oh, once we sort of get over the pig's back, as we would say around here, of this, we should be able to start traveling again. Part of me wonders, at the airports, we saw after 9/11, Chris, the security at airports just changed irreversibly. And in the industry, we talked about what travel was like pre 9/11 and post 9/11. What do you think is going to be the kind of changes that we're going to see? I mean, airports already, and I work with airports, and with respect to all of my aviation colleagues, it's hell. No one's enjoying going through airports these days, generally speaking. Is that experience, if we didn't think it could get worse, is that about to get a whole lot worse, Chris?
I think it is. And of course, that experience is the introduction to your holiday or your business trip or whatever. But I can't see how it's going to get less. If we start to factor in, these kinds of issues such as the COVID-19, and it's really about having or creating a bubble of confidence for travelers so they feel safe to travel, and how we do that we'll have to wait and see what technology is sort of developed to assist that. But as we know, these kind of rules and regulations change constantly. Rarely are they consistent at any airport in the world. So, one of the things that I don't think is mentioned enough in terms of transitioning from COVID-19 is leadership. Now, we've looked around the world in various different politics around the world, and we've seen great leadership and we've seen terrible leadership. The quality of leadership in terms of how tourism transitions out of this, I think, is paramount to this, because it's the leaders of our industry who are going to be driving the policies, who are going to be supporting the group, going to provide the recommendations on what we need to do as an industry, as an airport, as a destination. So that is a critical part of how we transition from this. It's rather than just make it up as we go along, as we've done in the past, there needs to be a plan or a series of plans that enable us to get to where we need to be. But no, it's not going to go. It's not going to get any easier.
Is that? But is just as you're talking there, I'm thinking, is that going to happen? Because you're absolutely right. Something as important, pre-COVID-19 as security, the threat of terrorism, etc., absolutely critical. Yet, if I'm going to the States, I have to take off my shoes before I get on a flight, but I don't have to if I'm in parts of Asia and in parts of Europe. Sometimes I'm challenged on the amount of liquids I can take. Other times I'm not as much. There's no consistency on that kind of stuff. If you equate that out onto the health side and the screening side, if there's no consistency, doesn't work, does it? I mean, this literally can only work if it's an absolute coordinated approach. And as far as I can see at the moment across the world, I'm not seeing a huge amount of coordination. I'm not seeing, effectively like a G20 summit of all the tourism ministers getting together to combine their knowledge. I'm not seeing that kind of collaboration and cooperation at the moment. If that's not going to happen, how are we going to get there?
I don't know. I mean, I was expecting to see some kind of announcements from ICAO, in terms of, aviation and the way things operate right now. I've not seen anything. The silence has been deafening for the most part. Sorry, Caroline.
Yeah. Beyond infrastructure relating to the actual process of transport, I think one of the things the questioner was also thinking about was not just on the way to the destination, but things when we get to the destination. So our hotel's going to have to look different. How are we going to manage? So you think about now, I mean, okay, I think about the hotels in China, some of the lobbies there, you could literally social distance in some of them. But I think if you look at the move towards something like boutique hotels, art series hotels, those kind of things, you're not going to be able to check in more than a couple of people in some of those areas. So do we think there's a broader place thing? Because one of the things that struck me in some of the literature is our cities changed after the Great Plagues of basically the last 2,000 years. Are we going to see that reflect in the way that we design hotels, the way we design experiences going forward, do we think?
Just as you were talking there, Carolyn, one thing flashed in my mind, which I'd never thought about before, never even considered. But when we look at some of the larger hotels around the world, and there's so many in Asia, when you look at the elevators that take you up to the 60th floor or whatever, how are we going to cope with that? Social distancing in elevators in hotels as just one example. How are we going to keep the flow of guests moving around properties in a safe but efficient way? I have no idea at this stage. I wouldn't know. But
I'd say it's probably a great time to be a hotel designer right now, because there'll be a lot of work that needs to be done.
Small boutique resorts, 2 levels maximum.
And an airport designer. There's been a lot of talk about this. This stuff about I mean, O'Leary over here in Europe has obviously mocked the idea, and I think quite rightly so, about this. Skip the middle seat.
That's actually one of the questions we have here.
Is that one of the questions? Whoever it was, that's a really great point, because obviously this whole skipping the middle seat, Chris. I mean, come on, it's got to be garbage. You're going to have the seats in front of you. Either way, that would mean you're removing about a sixth of the capacity, or a third actually of the capacity of an aircraft. And the low-cost carriers again, for all of our listeners out there that aren't as close to aviation, the low-cost carriers, they have to make that model work. They have to run at a minimum of 95% seat capacity, so 95% of people actually on the seats in the plane. Is this all missing the middle aisle seat? Is this just a load of garbage, Chris?
It's not. That's not going to work. I mean, I saw a report today on domestic flights within the US that are still operating. There are still some operating.
Wow.
The average load factor, because of social distancing and what have you, that operated last week was 10 people on a flight. It went massively increased this week. It went to 17.
Ooh. It just doesn't work. I mean,
it doesn't work. So the quality control in terms of the health risk, if that makes sense, is a vital part of the profitability of how airlines and other transport operators are going to have to work in the future, because it's the same for trains and it's the same for everybody else, for buses and everything else. So there has to be some kind of mechanism, health mechanism, established or determined to allow it to happen. What kind of technology or what kind of advice that requires, I don't know. But you can see the World Health Organization having to play a massive part in part of this leadership planning. So to work in conjunction with ICAO, IATA, CLIA, etc., to try and determine how they can move forward profitably and safely at the same time. It's a tough one, but middle seat, nah, ain't gonna happen.
Yeah, it's like you say, especially when you're probably less than 1 meter away from the seat in front or the seat behind you. I must admit, when I saw that come out, I was just thinking, this is just a publicity stunt or something. I mean, it just can't work.
Okay, think about a flight here, and this is not me trying to be sort of rude or crude or anything like that. But when we're on a flight, most of us all have to go to the bathroom. What happens when you go to the bathroom on a plane? You have half the aisle at the back of the plane or the front of the plane full of people queuing up next to people on seats next to each other. How are they going to do that? Is it going to be a ticket system? There needs to be systems in place that allow or that negate the risk that we're seeing right now with COVID-19 or any other kind of transmissible disease.
Chris, could I play devil's advocate there for a moment, which is those of us who are old enough to remember when British Airways launched the first flatbeds in business class. And I remember at the time, A, being in awe that they'd actually taken the step that travellers had wanted, and B, going, they must be bloody insane. The economics of this make no sense. And then what happened over time was more and more people came in and found out ways to use the space differently. Again, I wonder if we're going to see ways that we will use it differently. I don't know that we'll ever go back to sardines. I did have this vague thought was whether suddenly airlines will start asking you to sign a waiver, i.e. if you get COVID-19, it's not our fault if you want to sit and have cheap air transport. But my reaction is sometimes, and you touched on this earlier in your innovation, some of the innovation stuff, and of course we will have Tammy Marshall talking innovation, which is whether the very fact of survival will make people think innovatively about how we use that space. I mean, Air New Zealand in our part of the world, great example now, economy class, they've got this thing where you can, their seats will convert into a bed. If you buy 2 of the seats, the third one, the middle seat does disappear and it becomes a bed that you have to be pretty friendly with the other person, but you can spoon together in those seats. And so, I look at it and say there may be some innovative airlines out there who are doing that at the moment.
Yeah, profit always drives innovation. And, we're going to have to see some very creative ways, I think, of how we're going to do this. And this is all part of us not going back to the way it was.
Great. Now I've got a really interesting question here from Angelica, which I'm going to share. She's going, what kind of research into sustainability in terms of the sociology, so the human factors, sociology and behavioral approach is going to be necessary for our new world? So how are we going to get people to behave differently and train people to behave differently? It's a
To be
curly
perfectly
one.
honest, well, to be honest with you, Caroline, I think you're probably, with your skill set, I think you're probably best to answer that. But the way I would look at it initially is the fact that, just coming back to what I was saying earlier, that we're going to see behavioral change anyway. It's already starting to happen. How that transitions into behavior in terms of visiting a destination, I think a lot of that will come down to how visitation is managed by those destinations and what kind of visitor and how many numbers they want. So, this profitless volume kind of model that we've had in the past, hopefully, I think has gone for good. Angelica, that is a tricky question, and I think Carolyn, ironically, is probably better to answer that than I am.
Okay, well, I think let's make it a conversation, because I think one of the things that I would say, Angelica, is actually we do have quite a lot of broader, governments all over the world are investing in using the whole behavioral insights thinking. So there's, we've got quite a lot of thinking in that broader policy space that we can draw on. So we know we're using this to we're using get people to get better ways to pay their taxes. So one little sentence different in a letter actually netted UK Treasury 70 million more pounds. So we actually have a lot of those frameworks starting to emerge already. So I think we'll actually be knocking on the doors of the nudge units, as they're sometimes known, all over the world, to start saying, look, how do we get people to do that? And I think we'll need to be bringing more of that thinking into our design of things. So how do we get people to behave in the ways that we do? And some of that's context, some of that's changing things. But I do think it's also the change, maybe, Angelica, is, and I wonder if this was your intention, was also we need to change the thinking and nudge the thinking of the industry. And in a sense, that's what I think this pandemic will do. One of the things that's interesting is there's been a lot of conversation about whether this pandemic, people talk about it being a black swan or it's come from out of the blue. It absolutely has not. World Health Organization has been talking about this for 10 years now. We are seeing dozens and dozens of things happen that are there, and we can expect, the panel on species diversity came out this week and said we can expect more and more of these pandemics more and more frequently if we keep pushing into wild areas. So I think we actually need to change the mindset of the policymakers first, and then we can change the mindset of the customers that they can have that. But I think we've got tools, we've got units full of incredibly clever people who are working on this right now. But I know we've got a few academics on the call. I'd be saying go back and start thinking about this. And Angelica, if you are one of those people, I think I'd start preparing some courses and some training and get some really smart PhD students on it right now. Jed, Chris, did you want to add anything on that one?
No, I think that that was concise and straight to the point. I think that was some really good information there, Caroline. Thank you.
Well, just while you were talking there, Caroline, as well, a great point coming from Nigel Fell. Appreciate it will take some time, but will a vaccine be the catalyst for tourism to start again and therefore travel to just go back to business as usual? And I must admit, I was sort of, I think it's a fantastic point, because, we're talking about, social distancing and how, look, you can't do it in aircraft. Somebody else has raised a point there. You can't do it on coach travel, rail travel. That's not ultimately going to be the answer. Surely the answer is either, rigorously testing and I guess screening of people before they get on the aircraft, and then if you know and have confidence that there's nobody else on that aircraft that has got this, then it's okay to sit as we used to sit. So is Nigel's point there that look, once we have a vaccine, it can go back to normal, and is that then the risk that it does actually go back to normal?
Is that for me? All right. Okay. I suppose it is.
Anybody.
I was drifting off then. Nigel, thanks for the question. It's a really interesting one. But again, again, listening and looking at what's going on in terms of vaccines, and you know, what is it? It might take a year to have a quality vaccine be developed. Of course, that's going to help. Absolutely. Will it fix the problem? I don't really know. I mean, at the moment, we're all quarantined, you know, for minimum 14 days when we get off a boat or a plane. It was announced yesterday that they found out that the coronavirus lives in the nasal cavities for over 3 weeks. So those 14-day quarantines are kind of null and void a little bit. So the whole idea of the vaccine is one thing. How we dispel the fear and the anxiety that this is going to create is another. And that's the key for me. And I don't know what the answer is for that. And as Jedward just said earlier, you know, you can't do this on a train or you can't do this on a bus. I don't know. I don't know. I'd like to think so, Nigel. I'd like to think that is the answer. That is the silver bullet. But I don't know.
One of the things that I've been saying, because I've been talking about this in the, you know, travel as whatever normal will look like going forward for a while. And I think one of the things is that we do need to reflect on a little bit. And I'm sorry if this, you know, sounds a bit like tough love. A lot of the things that are going to happen are about all of the sum of all the individual choices that we make. So I can't say it's down to all of us and no one else, but I do think that all of the decisions that we all make as the industry are going to be that. And the advocacy that we do and what we're willing to tolerate will drive some of that. And even at an elite level, at a policy level, for example, here in Australia, the debate about when and how to shut down the economy, they pulled together a national cabinet, and it's fairly clear that some of the more rigorous social distancing were driven by the 2 states that had the highest incidence of this, and they persuaded the Prime Minister to go harder, which I think we've, you know, all lived to be grateful for. This will sound amazing to the rest of the world, but those of you who saw David Beerman's numbers on Tuesday, you know, we are in panic in Australia because we've reached 88 deaths for the whole country. But I think that what made that work was Australians got behind this. We still have a total support for doing this. And we're starting to get bored. I noticed this morning that when I went out to take exercise, that there were more cars on the road, but substantially our individual actions have all added up to that. So don't underestimate I would say the individual things that all of us can do. We can't do it on our own. And there are powerful forces out there that we know, but if each of us did something about this, the chances of tipping it the way we want it to go would be greater.
Couldn't agree more.
I think we should really start to look at wrapping up. So we're an hour and a half. Fantastic. We've still got so many people online. Thank you all so much for sticking with us and for being so engaged on all of this. Chris, have you got any final thoughts as we look to wrap up this session for today?
No, I'd just like to thank you, Carolyn, and everybody who dialed in for their support for the series, and just to reaffirm what you were saying, that, you know, this whole series is a bit like the chapters of a book. We're going to be looking at all different aspects of tourism and how we need what the key considerations that we need to factor into our thinking as we move forward. So I would encourage everybody, please, to register for the whole series and listen to some of the amazing people that we've got lined up.
Yep, couldn't agree more. So thank you. Look, thank you, Chris. Thank you to all of our audience for joining in. We really appreciate it. We're going to be posting up details of the webinar online on the WETAC group pages on LinkedIn and Facebook, as well as on the wetac.org website. Would ask you all to please join us for the third episode in the series, which is next Tuesday, the 5th of May, where we're going to hear from Professor John Koldowski, Tourism Research and Analytics, Leshan University in China, as he talks us through the current position and outlook for the global travel industry from his perspective. So you can join us at the times which will be shown just now, which is 1600 Sydney time, 1400 Singapore, 7 a.m. in the morning for us here in the UK, and for our friends in North America between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. But I guess most of you guys are catching the recording. Final thanks again to all of our supporters. The series has been hosted by me, Jed Brown of Low Season Traveller, and the producer, of course, was Carolyn Childs from My Travel Research. Have a great day, a great evening, and a great night, everybody, and we shall see you all next Tuesday.